I might just start with a bit of an introduction to FarmLab. So we are a soil management software company. We help people measure and manage their soil. We give people, we sort of liken ourselves to something like Salesforce for agriculture. We give agronomists and carbon developers the tools to better communicate their projects and better use their data to make more informed decisions about soil management. I mentioned it before, we got the Kiss the Ground poster up behind us because the topic of today is soil carbon, and we've just seen so much interest lately in soil carbon measurement, monitoring, which is absolutely fantastic. You know, the core of FarmLab and the reason we started 5 or so years ago was we had the hypothesis that if farmers had better soil data, they would better manage soil carbon because of all the benefits it brings to the environment and to agriculture and to productivity itself. So yeah, very, very keen to jump in. This is our first webinar in probably nearly 12 months. I do apologize for the hiatus. The last webinar you can find online. It's on the FarmLab webinars page. That was with actually Sinani. It was with your supervisor, wasn't it? Dr. Lynn McDonald, also at CSIRO. So look, without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Sinani Karunaratne, and the senior researcher from CSIRO, here to talk to us today about soil carbon measurement. So Dr. Karunaratne's research focuses on measuring, modelling and predicting variation in environmentally important properties in space and time. His current research work is focused on how such knowledge can be contributed towards better understanding and managing the effects of the agricultural land management practices and changing climatic scenarios on soil carbon. I should also mention here that Sinani has been working extensively with the Clean Energy Regulator here in Australia. And part of the reason we wanted to provide this webinar today was in response to a raft of questions we've been getting internally from our clients on the proposed Schedule 2 changes to the soil carbon offset generation method through the Australian Clean Energy Regulator. So whilst Dr. Karunaratne has been extensively engaged in those, we won't be discussing this specific legislation today, but we will be talking in depth about modelling practices, processes, and how to do everything in the carbon measurement modelling space. So prior to joining CSIRO, Sinani worked as a senior researcher for Agriculture Victoria and co-led research activities on the development of new methodologies, the use of next generation sensor technologies, proximal aerial satellite and pastoral agronomy research to enhance the productivity of Australian dairy production systems. So Sinani, we are incredibly pleased and grateful to have you with us today, joining us today. Very, very exciting. You've got, you bring together, I guess, experience and exposure from certainly from the agtech, from the technology side of the house, and from the soil carbon, soil mapping side of the house. So very keen. Sinani, I'll let you take it from here. Go for it.
Thank you, Sam, and hope we all can hear me. And also thank you, Sam, for the opportunity and inviting me for this particular presentation. And also thank you for all those who are joining from different parts of the world for this presentation. Now, let me share my screen.
What I might do whilst you get started there as well, Sinani, is put up a quick poll for everyone just to see where everyone's from there as well. So we'll share that. Take it away.
All right. Shall we start, Sam?
Go for it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to give you all like a very brief introduction to modeling soil organic carbon, especially considering space and time. I also like to acknowledge all the contributors and the collaborators work that's been contributed to this presentation, which I'm going to present today. All right. I'm not going to discuss about our soil carbon because I think everyone interested here is actually have a very good understanding, but mostly on the modeling and measuring approaches. So there are basically, I think there are basically like 3 or 4 measurements approaches to measure soil organic carbon in literature. That's the direct measurements, which is the gold standard, and then proximal sensing, remote sensing, and computer models. Now, the accuracy of these 4 different approaches and then their spatial representative vary. So if you measure at a point scale, direct measurements, they're more accurate, but their spatial representative is limited. It should also be mentioned that, other than the direct measurements, if you talk about the proximal sensing, remote sensing, computer models, they require data, direct measurement data. So there's no way that we can measure soil carbon from remote sensing if you don't have ground truth data to combine and develop models. So that's a very important consideration. Now, the computer models, which used to predict and simulate soil carbon, can be depending on different areas, like accuracy and the spatial representation can be varied. For example, if you are running a computer model for like a Farmscale or ERF emission reduction fund activity for a carbon project with the on-farm data sets, that can be quite accurate as closer to proximal remote sensing. But if you're running at a national scale, its accuracy will be low because it's a national representation. So it's very important that we identify these tools and approaches and use it appropriately depending on the scale and the type of application. Now, so using these measures to predict and measure soil organic carbon, so the whole idea is to actually to represent this carbon cycle within the modeling framework. So if you just summarize a carbon cycle, it's a complex process, but in a graphical way. So in terms of modeling, what's important is, identify the carbon addition to the soil and carbon losses. So it's not easy to measure each and everything. So in modeling terms, it's mostly related to how we're going to represent these drivers of carbon addition and losses, like in model drivers. That's a whole idea about soil organic carbon modeling. Now, if you discuss a little bit more, it's all about balance between what's put into soil and what's been lost from the soil. So soil organic carbon content or the stocks is a function of carbon input to the soil and then carbon losses from the system. Now, if you can manage this in appropriately, that's a way to build carbon. So so that's why it's very important to have this understanding. So when you look at the carbon sequestration and other aspects of the soil organic carbon, it's important that not everywhere will have equal potential to sequester carbon. So it's very important even we identify where, even within a farm, what's the feasible areas and then concentrate on those areas to enhance carbon. That's a very general understanding about when you look at the carbon sequestration projects. Now, as I mentioned, in terms of any type of modeling, it's all about representing these drivers of carbon inputs and losses in a modeling framework. And the learning from those models can be able to apply to unknown situation in terms of in space and time. Now, before we move to more details about types of modeling, I thought of just to give a very brief introduction to 101 on soil organic carbon. So carbon itself is soil organic carbon, which is an interested property in our case now. It's not only just carbon, it has different forms of carbon. It's important that we acknowledge these forms of carbon, especially if you're looking through developing models that are unique for a project scale application for carbon projects. The reason is that there are different levels of classification of soil organic carbon, and this particular classification is developed by CSRA, led by James Kimstad, and then by Jeff Baldock over the years. So which we consist of 3 main pools or fractions. Actually, the carbon pools are more conceptual in nature when you talk about models, but fractions are more measurable. So it's important that distinguish those terms. Now, there are 3 main fractions that can be measured in terms of soil carbon. That's called particulate organic carbon, humus-like carbon, and then resistant organic carbon. In Australian context, it's mostly dominated by charcoal because of the natural fire conditions. So knowing this composition of carbon is important when you go to some types of modeling. We can discuss a little bit more in detail later. This is a graphical picture of the POC, HOC, and ROC. In common terms, sometimes POC is more like a labile form of carbon, and then humus, and the ROC is more like a recalcitrant form of carbon in general literature.
Hop and rock writes the Sinani. That's what Lynn said last time we interviewed her. I have a general question here, which is, do you know, generally speaking, what kind of soil organic carbon is measured when we do lab-based testing? Are we looking at a combination of all three? What's when we measure soil organic matter and then use the constant to convert that to soil organic carbon? What are we looking at? Is it a combination, or is it?
No, currently under the Australian domestic policies, like under the emission reduction fund requirements, it's measure the total organic carbon by dry combustion, but there's also provision to develop mid-infrared or like infrared spectroscopic methods to estimate soil organic carbon. There's a provision under the methodology.
Can we separate the three? Have we found a measurement method to?
Yes, there's a mechanisms or the methods being developed by CSIRO on rapid prediction of these soil organic carbon fractions, and there's a ongoing work to actually to more popularize these methods, which is currently underway.
Fantastic. I mean, as you said, I think part of it is, we need to emphasize the importance of sequestering carbon for long periods of time. We have a lot of discussions around this. There's a lot of criticism even around the ability for soil to sequester carbon, given the duration that you can sequester carbon for. And so I think this is a really, really relevant piece of, knowing that there are different forms of soil carbon there. So good stuff. Interesting.
So when you look at the carbon, the fractions. So like this example from almost 10 years ago, there was a sort of a nationally collaborated project called SCARP, Soil Carbon Research Program. So there's some samples collected from New South Wales in different regions. And if you look at here, like the sample NSW00073 has like almost like around like 85 milligrams of carbon per grams of soil. So we think that it's like highest carbon concentration. But if you look at the composition, so it has more like a labile forms of carbon in that particular sample 73 compared to other in proportionately. Now, if there's a sort of drought and there's no carbon inputs continually adding to the system, there's a more chance that this might be subjected to vulnerability. So we calculate from this, knowing this composition, we calculate something called soil organic carbon vulnerability, which is like a division of the more labile forms by the more recalcitrant forms. So having those understandings is important. We can discuss more when you go to modeling. All right, with that very brief introduction to soil organic carbon and its composition, let's talk a little bit more on types of carbon models. I mean, there are different, like hundreds of different ways of developing models, but in our view, they can be classified into three classes called empirical or data-driven, mechanistic or process-based, and metamodels. But it's important to note that all these models are data-driven. To some degree, we require data, but this is how broadly we're going to classify these models. So we'll take some few examples and we'll try to go through a little bit in detail about these modeling approaches. What's important when you try to develop, not only static model, more like a dynamic models when you try to predict carbon and its composition or whatever we're interested in space and time. Now, graphically, the empirical models are like it's a relationship between the carbon drivers that we discuss. So if you're trying to develop a empirical model for to predict carbon in space and time, with time we need to have different types of covariates or exponential variables. So it can be like initial carbon stocks from a baseline survey, and then we can go backwards and calculate last 2 years NDVI, which is a proxy for biomass, and last 2 years climate. So that's then you develop an empirical model with whether it's a simple linear model or it can be a complex machine learning. Now with the process-based model, it has a process-based understanding of the flow of carbon in the ecosystem, which is very good because we give mechanistic understanding about how carbon flow from plant to litter to soil, and then different ways of losing this carbon. So there are large number of models, and the one of commonly used models is like ROTC, FullCam, Century Decent, and AppSim, which is a crop model but has a really good capabilities of modeling carbon as well. And this third type is called Metamodel. It's a hybrid model or fusion model between the process-based models and empirical model. So here we have the change in carbon predicted by the mechanistic model, and then you combine it with a variety of different environmental covariates where you can develop like a simple model. So it's a simplification of these mechanistic models. So if you do a comparison, so in empirical models, advantages are they are easy to develop. There are a variety of empirical models can be developed, from simple linear model to machine learning models. The disadvantages are required data to train, quite a bit of data, and application of these models to areas that's outside the training conditions is limited. Now, on the other hand, if you look at process-based models, that incorporate mechanistic understanding of these carbon flows. And once you calibrate these models, there's a provision that we can apply these models to wide conditions as long as they're being calibrated to those conditions. Now, disadvantage is like required additional data sets to run these models, because there's a lot of complexities of a lot of inputs, parameters, etc. in the process-based models. The meta models, as I previously described, they are very less complex than the process-based model, but initial investment for this development of meta models is high. That's because we need to have like a running process-based models to generate a change in carbon or stocks, and then you have to combine with the mechanistic model, with the empirical model like approach. But once it's developed, it's more readily applicable. So that's the advantage of having meta models compared to process-based models. So with that very high-level overview, let's go and have a look in a few examples of all these different modeling approaches. So the first thing is about developing example I've taken is like a nationally scalable dynamic space-time empirical model. So most of the carbon models that develop is like with a bunch of covariates. It's more like using digital soil mappings. They are more like a static. So when you look at the carbon sequestration projects, and then when you try to predict not only static layer, we want to predict how they change all the time. So the approach is like, combining different data streams. So we required on-ground measurements, measuring go to field and analyze in laboratory, and then we also get proximal sensing. So the proximal sensing is very important because it will reduce cost significantly, and it has a really high potential to get a large number of measurements and also capture the inherent spatial variability, which we haven't even touched that section in this presentation. And then you have a variety of geospatial data sets, and then you combine all these together and develop like a model in space and time.
Just a quick question. When we talk soil carbon proximal sensing, what are we sensing? Are we sensing soil carbon in this case, or are you looking at something correlated at a proxy for soil carbon?
So the proximal sensing is mainly talking not like EM or anything. I'm more like talking about infrared sensing. So it can be like a near infrared or mid infrared, where you develop a model with your spectral characteristics and with your measured data, and you can predict. So it's more about carbon content concentrations rather than any other measures.
We've got some great companies here in Australia, Hone being the one that comes to mind, doing this, and over in the US as well, the Yardstick is another fantastic startup looking at exactly this thing. So thanks for that clarification, Sinani. That's great.
Yeah. So the point is when you try to develop this model is we have like a bunch of variety of covariates. It's like, if you look at it's more like a data cube. And the one thing that we are very interested in is, rather than just putting in a bunch of covariates and fitting a model, we just try to derive innovative covariates and then combine with some mechanistic understanding. So we took some ideas from the agronomy and cropping industry, where they have things like degrees of days of drying. So we used something like that, derive innovative covariates for soil organic carbon, and then you derive time series of covariates, and then you develop model. So other important thing is soil data is collected very scatteredly. They're almost very not much high density. So it's very important that we develop this the time series of data sets, and then build models in order to capture that variability that exists with the time, and also with the across the landscape scale. So once you have that data set ready and create like a big data cube, and you can start have like a function, like a machine learning function, and then you have spatial and temporal model drivers, and then you can start predicting carbon over the time and across with the landscape scale. Now, when you do predictions, it's important that, this is a model prediction. So we're looking at areas like an area of research, like, whether this model is applicable to this part of the landscape scale, or there can be like, whether it's uncertain. So if it's uncertain, we will have to collect more data and incorporate into the modeling framework in order to improve our modeling. So it's a constant learning environment rather than like just one-off model. It's constantly update over the time. So that's very briefly to discuss about like generation of empirical models, and there are variety of algorithms that can be used to develop these models, including like the simple algorithms to like very complex algorithms. All right, so with that, I'd like to move to second type of soil organic carbon modeling frameworks. That's process-based models. So I have put a little bit of high weight to these process-based models during this presentation. There's quite interest on this area. That's a reason to incorporate, and there's areas that we can improve these process-based models. Now, why process-based models? So the process-based models, as can provide information addition to the carbon change and then stocks something like vulnerabilities, especially if you have like process-based models with a multi-pool rather than a single pool of carbon. Multi-pool, like like ROTC, we have like a DPM, RPM, humus, or inert organic matter and biome, like 5 different pools. So we can look at how vulnerable the soils are. There are more than 250 models, so there's a choice. We have plenty of choice to select whatever we like, and these models are applied from a very nanometer scale to like a kilometer, like a large scale applications. And it's important, and there's a more trend now use this model in spatial context and then try to come up with the model drivers, using remote sensing. So that's a very important area of research that we are working currently, and with some collaborators, which we have some examples later, that we're looking at how we can improve these models. Because in any type of model, and if your inputs are or your parameters are not good, your outputs is also not good. So it's garbage in, garbage out, simple as that. Now, to give a quick idea, assuming that you not have much interest, do with previously with process-based models, I just thought of giving you a quick introduction to process-based models. So I have taken here an example for process-based model called ROTC. There are DNDC, there are different models that can be taken as this example. So the reason I took ROTC, it's been embedded within the Australian National Carbon Accounting System called FullCAM, run by the Department of Industry, Science and Energy, TISA. Now, in addition to Australia, there are other countries like UK, Canada, and if I can remember, even Japan. There are modified versions of ROTC being embedded within their national carbon accounting frameworks. So it's highly used. And the second thing is that ROTC is a very simple model, required very few inputs. So if you're trying to run a model spatially, and if your model is too complex, it's a challenge to run those models. So it's very simple. And the third thing is like, the previous research led by CSRO, all those carbon fractions can be used to replace the conceptual pools of the ROTC, like RPM with the POC fraction, humus with the HOC factor fraction, and the inert organic matter with ROC fraction. So that means we really don't want any land use history. We can initialize these models in landscapes at any point of time when you have this fraction. That's a big advantage in my personal view. And it will reduce uncertainty significantly when you try to quantify the soil organic carbon stock change. Now, to give you like science behind in terms of ROTC, it's a decomposition happens using a first order decay process for the active pools. So out of these 5 pools, inert organic matter is as name it says, it's an inert. It's not active pool. All other pools are as active pools. Now, when you look at the carbon moving from one time step to next time, so it's a function of you have the current carbon stock for a given pool, and there are modification factors by temperature, moisture, and cover, and then using this first order decay process, and then to determine what carbon goes to the next month and what goes to atmosphere as CO2. Now, I have highlighted here different rate constants for temperature, moisture, and cover. So knowing these drivers of the carbon in the model will enable us to think more deeply how we can replace with remote sensing approaches.
I was just going to ask about that, Sunani. So cover in this case, is that likely candidate for remote sensing?
Exactly. So we have example that we're using like a remote sensing to gather cover information across the landscape in also with the time.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Now, let's give a quick introduction to again with some of the important consideration for process-based modeling. So this is like a very general overview that we came up like almost like 5 years ago with Tom Bishop from University of Sydney. So it's mostly like when you look at the process-based modeling, we need to think about the initialization, model parameters, and model inputs. So now, not all these aspects are related to all the process-based models. If you're running like a single pool model, it's not required, say, like the carbon fractions, because it's total organic carbon. Now, so if you look at the first factor of important for any process-based model, initialization, there are different ways of initialization. So the traditional way of initialization, spinning up, running, sometimes called as running for equilibrium. And what we preferred is using our measurable fractions, CSR defined measurable fractions, and there are Peter transfer functions. There are some work done in Germany, very cool work on deriving these Peter transfer functions.
And just for the sake of our listeners, Peter transfer function is usually where you take some soil test results and you convert them to another result using a calculation. So, for example, sand soil clay and organic carbon to equate available water capacity from those results. Yes, sorry, just to clarify this, Nani.
Yeah, that's correct. Like it's a sort of a equation, mathematical equation that you can derive like a difficult to measure properties with the easily measured properties, soil properties. And then you have the rate constants. Those are the parameters which can be standardized or calibrated. And then biomass, which is a key input for carbon. There are carbon models with the plant components, and ROTC doesn't have a plant component. That's what we're trying to improve, that component of the model. And that can be measured in the field, or can be modeled from another model, or can be derived from satellites. And the land management practices, some models are quite sensitive to land management practices like Century and Descent. We require that information, together. We go through more details, and the application of these details is differ based on the where we're going to apply this model. All right, this is an example from my colleagues who are doing a very fantastic job running these national scale models. This is example from national inventory from Australia. So in national scale, we're using data sets. Some are spatially explicit data, all are spatially explicit data sets, but some are like grid-based data, some are more polygon-based or very large area. For example, we have the soil carbon fractions mapped across the continent. So those are used to initialization of models. Those are grid-based. And the climate series data, they are like a 1 kilometer gridded data. But if you look at crop and land management data, they comes from a survey. So it's quite broad. It's very difficult to find all this pixel-based information at national scale. So that's how it's modeled being, you calculate the inputs. Once you have all those inputs, you combine everything, and we have this fantastic model, full cam, in middle sitting, and then you combine everything and you run it. At national scale, it's in Australia. Across the continent, for land sector, it's run at 25 meter spatial resolution and monthly time. So it's a huge amount of data being generated from this modeling. So that's national scale. So if you look at that previous slide, at national scales, here initialization is done using measurable fractions. Rate constants are calibrated for Australian conditions, crop and biomass inputs and carbon inputs from the model, and then land management information from the survey census data. Now, nationally, it's due national behavior of carbon dynamics, but it's not very straightforward to apply this concept to a project level for carbon. Let's take an example to applying these models to project scale. So, as I said, a national scale modeling represents the behavior of dynamics in average, but in project scale required, customized inputs, initialization, and parameters. That's to get a realistic estimates. And also required true data that can be validated this simulation. That's a requirement if you look at the current methodologies that develop. That's required to collect these true data sets and also quantify the uncertainties. And once you have like a lot of project scale information, that information can be fed into like improvement of the national scale models. So that's like an all win-win solution for everyone. Now, this example is running a Rotherham State carbon model for famous this Brigula site that we use always for our testing. And this is calibration done using like optimization algorithms. And once you optimize, you can get a really quite accurate simulations with time. But you require more data. So the models are improved, all these process-based models are improved when you have more temporal time steps. That's important. Like no model is perfect. So when you have to train these models, then they get improved over the time. Now, in this example, the models are initialized again using measurable fractions. So we do have the starting condition in 1982. We know what's the measured fractions, 3 fractions. And then rate constants are calibrated. That's the model parameters. The key rate constants related to the decomposition of these active pools. And then we had the observed data, and then we had the biomass also measured. Now, imagine like, you're going to apply this process-based models to a carbon project, and we might not have all this information. And if you try to collect all this information, your cost of running a project will increase substantially, measuring all these other inputs. So that's why we're looking for other alternatives. And another important area of modeling is to calibration. So in this particular example, the key rate constant that decompose the carbon being calibrated using a Bayesian approach, where you had some prior distributions, and we tried to calculate the distribution or the postulated distributions. Now, example below in the graph, you can see starting carbon levels around like I think 37 tons, and you can see the red line is just like simulating as standards. The gray bars, gray color shaded area shows the uncertainty created of our simulated results through the uncertainties in the parameters. So when you look at modeling, there are uncertainty comes from the model structure, model inputs, like model drivers, they're not perfect, and then also parameters. So there are certain.
And I have a quick question there regarding the, I'm going to use the non-scientific term, the spikiness of that graph.
Yeah.
is that yeah. What's driving that? Because it looks like maybe seasonal effects, in-season effects with rainfall and other things that the model's factoring in for yearly
exactly.
annual carbon cycles.
Exactly. That's because of the when the growing season happens, the end of growing season, you dump a bit of carbon, and then most of those carbon will be goes to atmosphere, depending on the carbon use efficiency, and then you get stabilized, and then you get again. So if you look at the composition, most of this POC, particulate organic carbon, or the labile forms, they might disappear. Like most of the plant debris and the residues will be disappear within 1 year. If you go to like a harvest, after harvest, you will see some residual, and then you go for 1 year, you will not able to see them. So some part will go to the soil, and most of them go to atmosphere because of the decomposition.
Now this is cropping or pastures? We're looking at a cropping model.
It's a cropping, if I can remember correctly. Yeah, because you can see that fluctuation. But even in pasture, depending on the growth season, you can see those fluctuations.
Yep, fantastic.
Yeah. All right. Now, when you think about this model, how are we going to improve these models? Now, the key we think is use of remote sensing and then also use of on-farm data sets. So this is a collaboration with the University of Sydney. We're working on a project, so where we try to get the on-farm data sets and also remote sensing to improve these models. And we just try to.
To all the ag tech companies watching, please pay attention to this. It's probably right up your alley.
Yeah. So we're very much interested on getting this yield data, because when you know the yield data and then you know the crop and then harvest index, you can actually calculate the what's biomass production. And that can be a proxy, or even calculate the actual carbon inputs. In traditional terms in carbon accounting, like even running national model, it's all based on the yield. And then you calculate the biomass and you calculate the allocations and you calculate the carbon inputs. So if you know, like if you have access to like yield data, that's really valuable information to run these carbon models, because you get that precise information like precision agriculture data sets with the spatial explicit data, and you can see the variability. So if you look at here, so this is a farm that University of Sydney is working in southern New South Wales, where you can see the variation of the yield. So there can be underlying soil constraints affecting the biomass production. If there's constraints, those areas are limited in accumulation of carbon because there's constraints. Rather than we go and measure each and every area, we can use this type of information to govern or run our models as inputs. Second input example is taken here is like a fractional cover. There's a really great data sets coming from the both Sentinel and Landsat imagery sensor, where you calculate the fractional cover. So this fractional cover has three products called bare soil, green fraction, and non-photosynthetic. In this example, is just clipped to the bare soil fraction, and you can see the variation with the time. Now, if you can remember in the Rotherham State carbon model, there's a factor or governing driver called cover factor. So we can use fractional cover as a proxy to replace those cover factor terms, and when you run the model spatially. Second example is about getting these different land management practices. For example, in this example, we were just trying to predict different management practices like stubble retain and fallow, etc. I'll try to take your attention to this top right-hand side of this image, where you have like majority of is colored in orange. That's a stubble retain. Now, if you know the farm boundary, there are different products, including CSRO, there's something called e-pedix. We can find out, okay, that particular area, that's a majority of pixels is from the orange. That's stubble retain. And then if you look at our prediction algorithms, the uncertainty, so you have a high probability that this is actually being classified as a stubble retain. So when you run the models, and if you combine this information, you get more realistic idea about land management practices. But as everyone knows, the classification is a important area in remote sensing, still require more data sets and ground truth information to improve. But that's another area that we like to explore and then combine with our process-based models. And the next example is taken from getting carbon inputs. There's three catchments we tested in this case, again, with the University of Sydney as the collaboration project, where we had three catchments called Cox Creek, Hillston, and Matama. These catchments are located within the state of New South Wales. And these catchments are sampled in different time steps, initially in the baseline, for example, in Cox Creek in 2010, Hillston in 2002, and then Matama in 2013. And then resample again in 2020, and then for Cox Creek, Hillston in 2015, and Matama in 2019. Now, what we did here, we look at combining the different ways of getting carbon inputs using yield and harvest index, and then also method that we developing called transpiration, partition of transpiration to get the carbon inputs based on ET and NDVI. There's a full conference paper we submitted, the Kate Colley from the University of Sydney on initial results from this work more recently. So the approach here is you start with the conditions and you look at the different carbon inputs and look at the estimation of carbon in the end of your resampling period. So to do this approach using the yield and house, we require the crop type and all additional information. So it's running these things across like a large catchment. It's time consuming and it takes more time. But with a simple transpiration approach combining with remote sensing data with the Rotherham State carbon model, we were able to get very similar results. Still, the work is in progress, and it's very promising to look at these approaches. How are we going to combine these data streams with the process-based models? All right, so that's I think enough for talking about the second type of modeling, that's called process-based modeling, and we discussed initially about the data-driven process-based, and then finally we move into looking at the time. It's almost less time. Let's finish this quick. So about the development of spatially explicit metamodels. So the metamodels is a simplification of process-based models where we get the change in carbon from a process-based model. Yeah. So it can be change in carbon, even it can be absolute stocks. And then you combine with a bunch of covariates that can be easily found. Those covariates can be dynamic, change with the space and time, and some can be static. I'll take an example here. So we have sites representing the major cropping region in Australia, the croplands and the grasslands. partial lands. And then these are the sites that we use to run the process-based model. In this instance, we use a national carbon accounting model, FullCam.
Sinani, just quickly, just to touch on the covariates you mentioned, can you give listeners an example of what some covariates might be in this case?
Yes. So in this case, we use covariates like a dynamic covariates like a carbon inputs, and that's a dynamic variable, and then the rainfall, and then ET as the dynamic variables, and then as a static variables, it was like initial carbon stocks, and then the composition of the carbon stock, the vulnerability. That we discussed very briefly about the composition of different carbon stocks at a given location. So those are like static, and the discounted dynamic model inputs are more like, if you look at rainfall, rather than just taking rainfall, we just make a weighted function to get like a dynamic covariates discounted. So that's how we gather those covariates. Now, with the stock change, so that stock change part of this equation is derived from a process-based model, in this instance, national carbon accounting model, FullCam. And then the advantage here, like because we had like around like 1,000 locations to say, we developed separate models for croplands and pasture lands, and we had 1,000 locations to run the model, and the model runs like every month. And we had like plenty of data to train a model. So that's the advantage of, rather than if you train a model with the 4,000 locations just only spatially, or are we going to train a model with almost 100,000 locations with the time? You get huge amount of data points, and you can develop a model. And then we did a independent validation. So once we develop the models, we apply this model to this time series of all these locations for the croplands and then the grasslands, and we did a comparison. So I must say that this comparison, your y-axis is your meta model predicted change, and your x-axis is the carbon stock change model by the FullCam model. Now, the accuracy of this approach is depending on how well you calibrate your process-based model. If your process-based model is not well calibrated, obviously your meta model also going to be affected because there's an error propagation. But in this way, we can actually run and predict carbon more easily compared to running a process-based model. So that's the advantage of this approach. So we still working on this. So there's previous some work been done on the similar area, and we're just trying to expand this work and more deeply about all this, getting all this dynamic and input more model drivers in running these models and calibrating. All right, I think I covered all three main types of modeling approaches, which probably using most of the carbon work. Finally, just to conclude my presentation, this is what we're thinking more on, like a framework towards soil carbon modeling across different spatial scales and now with the time. We think that there are mainly like 5 stages. The first stage is more important stage is actually getting the data sets. It can be measurements. So measurements means like, real measurements, or it can be proximal measurements, because proximal sensing is good as sometimes the real measurements. Their predictions are quite accurate nowadays with all these improved algorithms. But our gold standard is they're still going to field and collecting data. That's important. We still continue that work. And then collecting the data sets. These can be on-farm data sets, including sensors. Like we farms now have like a sensors like drones and other things. All these data sets are important when you try to think about different modeling approaches. And then very important that we think about this remote sensing time series, a very high resolution. I just heard that yesterday Landsat really launched its Landsat 9. There'll be new functionality with high temporal resolution. We get more data sets over the time. And the second stage is I think the most important to some degree is to rearrange these data sets, and that takes time. We need to rethink about our model drivers and what model causing this variation in space and time for soil organic carbon, and we need to rearrange these data sets. That still take more time and more thinking and more broad thinking about how to incorporate these vast amount of data sets in terms of a really useful manner. That's challenge, but that's area of interest for researchers. And the third stage is modeling. So there's no one model is perfect, and there's what we think is like ensemble of models, whether it's a data driven, process based, or meta models, is important. And because a certain model will behave, or its predictions or simulations will be more accurate in certain part of the landscape scale, but not in certain part of a system, So it's important that we understand this and then identify what's the most appropriate way. The holistic view is like, if you can use all these models and come up with a sort of a, uh, uh, averaging approach, that will be give more realistic outputs. And the stage 4 is most about thinking about identify the appropriate modeling framework. So if you're running a model for like a large area, whether what model is suitable, or whether that model calibration is suitable for that particular region, or whether the variation can be captured from that model, that need to be tested and identified. And then the last stage is, once you identify the appropriate model or combination of model, use those models at project scale or whatever, and then use it for policy decision making for if you are a policy maker. So that's all about the general framework. And
I love this slide, Sonali. I have to say, this framework is amazing, and I'm sure we've got a whole lot of viewers right now that are just screenshotting this, because this is super interesting from how and kind of describing a lot of what we're trying to do in the tech scene across the industry and with soil carbon measurement at the moment. So there are a series of solutions out there right now that are trying to solve individual pieces of this, be it through better measurement, be it through introducing the modeling itself, to collecting the on-farm data to inform pieces of the model. And I really think this slide does a really good job at outlining the need to collaborate to bring all the data into a central system. And I don't think there's one solution out there that does all of this. Happy to be corrected for our viewers. Certainly we in FarmLab are very focused on supporting the collection of that data. I think the rearrangement of the data sets is probably where we sit, and we partner with labs and spectral sensor companies like the ones I mentioned before to do so. But even then, we're now working with other partners to support their modeling tools through that sort of stage 2 process. There is a question here, so I don't mean to ramble on, but at the project scale, and this is a really important piece, because we've been looking at some of the examples you've given have been for quite large areas, scale across large regions, maybe various soil types, and then we've also been talking about how we do this at the farm scale. And I think that's just an important point to touch on. And I wonder if you've got any suggestions on how data might differ at each of those scales. So regional data, obviously, there's going to be some variability in the number of soil samples you can afford, over a given area compared to the farm scale, and maybe other sensor data sets. Do you want to expand on that at all, Sonali?
Yeah, it's all depending on the scale of your project area. So if you look at very large areas, if you're trying to model carbon across the rangelands, it's a very large area across the continent in Australia. So your model drivers will be different if you try to run it through carbon estimation area under project. For example, the temperature is important driver of soil carbon, but temperature might not be important driver at a project scale, because the reason is that if you look at your input data for your modeling, say if you're taking data from silo database, which is 5 kilometer spatial resolution, you have exactly one value, temperature. So it's important that you identify in terms of a project scale. I think it will be more important to get proxies, or at least the precision agriculture data sets, the yield measurements or the time series of that data sets will be important if you try to build a model, more like a data-driven model. But if you're trying to run a process-based model for a project scale, it's more important that you basically have to initialize your model correctly. If your initialization is incorrect, your simulations will be difficult to correct, because you're running a shorter period of simulations rather than running thousands of years. So it's that those are the. I think it's very important that depending on the scale and depending on type of project, you identify your model drivers, and then you give more attention to gather much as possible direct measurements, or in terms of proxies for represent those drivers.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sonali.
Yeah, I think with this slide, we have 10 minutes to go. I can conclude my presentation. just like to thank a few of the collaborators in CSRO with our staff that will be contribute a lot to this work, and also the external collaborators for helping and to present some of the facts that we presented within this presentation. Yeah. Thank you very much. And also not to forget about the two federal government agencies, Department of Industry, Science and Energy Resources and the Clean Energy Regulator, who've been very supportive for our work. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Senani. And what we might do is turn to questions now. So, Senani, if you want to stop holding your, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we'll jump into a bit of Q&A. So, just for all the attendees out there, if you have burning questions, please stick them in the Q&A now. I know we had one during the presentation there too, so we can touch on that first. So, Senani, this came up earlier around in some of the earlier modelling discussion, which are what are the best covariates to consider when modelling carbon. So we've touched on covariates quite a bit, and I might make this a bit more specific. So let's drill down into Farmscale now, because I know, with our attendees, Farmscale is kind of what everyone really cares about. So if we talk Farmscale, what have you found? What are the best covariates?
So with the Farmscale applications to develop models, if you can get information like depending on the resolution, like NDVI, it should be remembered that when you look at NDVI gets saturated at a certain point of the growth season. So you might have to look for other alternatives like enhanced vegetation index will be much better. And it's important that you develop your covariates, just not like NDVI. Just think about growing season NDVI, or even think about a time series of NDVI during the growing season. That's an important variable. And it's not. We should also not forget about those are more dynamic variables with the data-driven approaches, but also not to forget about the important variables like clay content, because clay is important variable for stabilization of soil carbon. So having those type of static variables also important, and also if you don't have clay, you can use a proxy like a EM 35 surveys that as a proxy which can be used as a representation of the variation. So those are probably the important drivers at Farmscale.
Now I've got another question here in the chat from Jason Bradley, and this is a nice little segue into the next into what you just said here, Senani, which is thanks, Senani. This presentation is very thought-provoking. One thing I continue to struggle with is that all these models are inferred or proxy measurements, albeit they are based on some ground truth data, but the data is not true measured data on a large scale. Yeah, that's right. What are your thoughts on broad scale true measurements based on technologies such as mobile inelastic neutron scattering? I haven't heard of that before, so I hope you have there, Senani. Yeah, I will be Googling it after this, Jason.
Yeah, me neither, but I think the gold standard, Jason, is actually measuring them in the field. What we found most of the work done is that yes, we are using proxies because it's very difficult to measure everywhere, but the disadvantage with the proximal approach is that we still have to go to field and collect data. That's why we just try to represent the proxies. The models are they're not perfect. They will explain certain amount of variation, and there's always an unknown variation that models cannot explain. So we admitted that as long as we know what's the variation that's explained. So when you go for a carbon accounting perspective, as long as you know the model uncertainty, that can be used as a discount factor to find out, this is the model explained variation, that's unexplained variability, and then we know, how certain we are about our estimates. Now, if there's a way we can get more measurements, through training the proximally sensors. I specifically don't know about this inelastic neutron scattering method, but that's not also direct measurement. That's also sensor. So it's more similar to use of near infrared spectroscopy techniques in field scales. There are certain I think companies and people are using these sensors, and they're using very effectively, even in Australia. Now, as long as these sensors been properly calibrated for different conditions and know their accuracies, I think they can be used. But still, the gold standard is actually measurements, but we use those measurements to calibrate and also validate any type of modeling, whether it's a data-driven or process-based, or whether it's a meta-models. We still require data.
Thanks, Melanie. Good answer. Next question here from Melanie Zeppel. Thanks, Melanie. So are you confident comparing a model with full cam? Great question. Would it be more robust to compare the model with measured data? So I did, and I did pick up that some of the model calibration you were using was calibrated against full cam. So do you want to just expand on that there, Sonali?
Well, it's all depending on, Melanie, like, how you, what's your purpose? Like, if you're using a model, the whole purpose is to reduce the cost. If you go to collect samples every sampling round, that's costly. So minimize the cost using your models. Now, confident of using full cam, it's depending on how you initialize your model and what your inputs. As I said, like, any model, depending on how you calibrate and then how you initialize these models, that's affect our simulations. Another thing is, like, these models need to be constantly updated. They're not once done. As long as you get a new data set, we need to again rerun and calibrate and update. So it's a constant learning process even for models like us. They always learn from the new data and then adapt. So if you have, say, like, if you have measured soil organic carbon fractions and correct carbon inputs, I think the random state carbon model, in my personal view, will work.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'll make a note of that too there. So thank you. Our last question here from Neil. So thanks, Neil. Is the uncertainty spatially distributed? So I take it that's the uncertainty of some of the models that you've been showing us today there, Sonali.
Yeah. So the uncertainties, as I said, like, the uncertainty comes from any type of modeling. It's from the model structure, model inputs, and then the model parameters. So there are a lot of work being done by different research groups across the world on this aspect. And I'll just mention, I mean, this kind of touches on some of our discussions prior to the webinar here, Sonali, around the kriging of residuals and using kriging as a technique to manage spatial uncertainty. Yeah. So if you have like a on-farm data sets, you can use the traditional geostatistical methods like, ordinary kriging. Now, advantage of use that, as long as you have a good spatial structure with a nice variogram and you fit your model, and then you can use kriging algorithm to estimate the unsampled locations. So compared to some of the machine learning models, kriging will give, like, the kriging uncertainty, the variance, and that can be used to calculate the prediction uncertainty. Now, if you compare with more like a statistical approaches with the data, like a machine learning modern approaches, it's more like a predictions. But there are ways that use, like, the models are bootstrapped, running hundreds of different combinations of samples to calibrate the model, and you get predictions. You also can calculate the uncertainties around that, and there are a lot of work now being done, even within my colleagues within CSIRO, on looking at where these models can be applicable. So with all those small tools, where the model can be applicable, and that can be lead to, like, identify the very good models. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we're just on PM, so I mean, technically we've gone over time by 15 minutes, but I think it was totally worth it. This was absolutely fantastic, Sonali. So look, what we'll do, I think there's been a few people that are really keen to get a hold of this. We're going to publish this on the FarmLab website. It'll be available there. So everyone who's registered as an attendee will get the link on where they can view this and share it later on. A big thank you to Sonali. That was really thought-provoking, and I think you've just given us about 3 years worth of science to digest. Science to digest over the next 3 years, I should say. That was just so interesting. So just a big thank you to all of our attendees and everyone who's come along. As I said, we'll put some notes, and we'll put the recording of the webinar online, and have a wonderful day. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Okay, bye for now.